Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 73 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Calgary Flames, in which the Sharks have lost 5-3. Now, technically on the surface level here, it is yet another loss for the San Jose Sharks, so you might be thinking, oh, yet another disappointment, yet another embarrassment, but realistically, this is the type of loss that you want to see from the San Jose Sharks, and it is a bit weird to say you want to see a type of loss. You would more so want to see your team win, but the fact of the matter is that the San Jose Sharks are, at least at the moment, the start of the day, the worst team in the NHL, and have definitely been the worst team recently in the NHL. And so you're more often than not going to see a loss. But it is significantly more interesting to see the loss that they had here tonight against the Calgary Flames, or today against the Calgary Flames, compared to the loss that they had a couple of nights ago against the Vancouver Canucks. Because here tonight, it was actually pretty close. It was actually relatively back and forth. The Sharks played a pretty okay game, and so even though they end up being a loss, which is technically a positive considering it helps the Sharks draft position, it was a game that was at the very least watchable. There have been so many games this season in which people would almost certainly want to turn off the TV or even leave the game if they happen to be there about halfway through. The fact that the Sharks have had more than like a dozen of those types of games is quite the embarrassing look, but here tonight it was not one of them, so that is at the very least a slight positive there. However, this game definitely started like, and certainly seemed like, it was going to be another one of those types of games, as the Calgary Flames put up the first 2 goals of this game before the Sharks even managed to get a single shot, and that's not because the Flames scored like 2 goals in the first minute. The Flames scored 2 goals in the first 10 or so minutes, and yet the Sharks just could not seem to get a single shot on net. And so I was already giving out those exasperated sighs about, oh, here we go again, the Sharks going to get embarrassed, another 7-0 loss in the books or something along those lines. But at about the halfway mark of the first period, the Sharks definitely managed to turn it around and would even cut the lead in half with a goal from Logan Couture to make it 2-1 Calgary at the end of the first period. And in the second period, that response continued, which has been a rarity thus far this season. While the Sharks have started first periods rather well multiple times, it always seems to fall apart past that opening frame. The Sharks are literally the worst team in the league when it comes to holding on to leads after the first period, and here tonight, not having a lead, it seemed as though it was just going to go the way of the Canucks game a couple of days ago. But the Sharks would not only manage to tie the game up with a goal from Nico Sturm, but also take the lead with a goal from Martin Kaut. It would be quickly tied up again, but the Sharks had a lead at a point in this game, which is notable to say the least. And so it was ending up a 3-3 game at the end of the second period. So technically anyone's game in the third, but it would be Nazem Kadri with the only goal on a manned net in the final frame of this game, and eventually a Tyler Toffoli empty netter would put it away. But like I said, a watchable game from the San Jose Sharks. You were able to stay tuned and stay engaged into this game for the full 60 minutes, and definitely an improved performance from the San Jose Sharks roster as a whole compared to the previous game. When it comes to the bottom of the standings here, obviously we have an extremely exciting update for the San Jose Sharks in what seemed as potentially impossible as recently as just a couple of months ago. The San Jose Sharks at the beginning of the day find themselves last place in the league. Yes, that is right. A team that was maybe 6th or even 7th last a couple of months ago now is dead last in the league. It's pretty crazy to say the least. The fact is that they showed a stat on the broadcast today that ever since February 14th, which is just over a month's time from now, about a month and a half actually, so the Sharks have a record of 2-14-4, now technically 2-15-4. The next worst team was the Montreal Canadiens, who had at the very least 6 wins for themselves. That is 4 more wins than the San Jose Sharks. So it has just been an absolutely horrific last couple of months for San Jose, and while this has been really difficult to watch as a San Jose Sharks fan, in the grand scheme of things, it is technically a positive because it turns their draft lottery odds of like 5 5% into draft lottery odds of over 18%, being now currently last place. So if we take a look at this, the Canadiens still at the top there in 5th last with 62 points, still very far out of reach of San Jose. The Ducks did play a game. They went up to 72 and stood pat at their 56 points, but still 3 points cleared of the Sharks. The Blackhawks now with 2 games in hand on San Jose, still a point in head. But the obvious big news was the Blue Jackets. Yesterday they played against the New York Islanders. They went into overtime, so they were always going to get at least a single point, but they managed to win in overtime as well, tying them with the San Jose Sharks. But because they have 2 games in hand on San Jose, the Sharks are the team that is last place. And we will see later on tonight the Blue Jackets will be in action against the Montreal Canadiens, so a chance for the Sharks to get even more breathing room in this position. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Barabanov, Couture, and Agazino. Even after the disastrous performance the previous night against the Vancouver Canucks, not many changes were made to the forward lines, just a small swap, which we will get to a bit later, but the first line notably was kept together, Barabanov, Couture, and Agazino, and this ended up being a smart decision for David Quinn, because this was likely the most productive, or potentially productive, I guess I should say, line for the San Jose Sharks. Not only did they get a goal in this game, that one came from Logan Couture, but they had multiple great chances, and the player who really got many of them was Andrew Agazino. And I tweeted this out during the game, he has been potentially the most underrated player over the last 3 games for the San Jose Sharks ever since he's been called up, potentially even their best forward since that point. In that game against the Oilers, even though he was on that 4th line, he still had a beautiful pass to set up a Steven Lorentz goal. Then in the game against the Vancouver Canucks, not only did he manage to get a shorthanded goal, but he also had one of the very, very few offensive chances that any Sharks forward actually got in that entire game. And then here tonight, he does get the secondary assist on the Logan Couture goal, but that's not really the notable part of his game. The notable part is the fact that he probably could have had a hat trick in this game based on the chances that he got 3 amazing opportunities here tonight. He probably should have had at the very least one of them, but unfortunately did not have the finish to be able to do that, and that was technically the difference maker in this game, considering the Sharks did technically lose by a single goal if we don't count the empty netter, but certainly no fault to Agazino there. He got those opportunities. Now, I'm not going to say that he was dominant on the ice. It's not as though it was like a Timo Meier type performance where every single shift that he would come on immediately was just centered around Agazino, but the fact is that he found himself in the right place at the right time more often than not, which is definitely, better than many of the other Sharks forwards thus far this season and in this game. Now, obviously, this would be more exciting if this was like Willie Meckland or Daniil Gushin or Thomas Bordelot or some other younger, more prospect type call-ups from the Barracuda, but still it is interesting to see Agazino being able to do this. When it comes to the second line, we had Hertl and LeBanc being joined by Jacob Peterson, so a small swap with Noah Gregor. Gregor was on that second line against the Canucks, now on the third line. Peterson was on the third line against the Canucks, now on the second line, and this is a swap that doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense, but I don't also hate it either. Gregor, while I was happy with Gregor's performance in the previous game, it's not as though it was amazing. No player on the Sharks was actually amazing in that previous one, and so it's really not the end of the world to see Peterson jumped up to the second line. I thought he was okay. I thought generally the second line was pretty decent. Hertl had I would say a good game. Not amazing, not dominant, not $8 million, but for the level that Hertl has been out more often than not this year, I would say it's in the upper echelon of the games that he has played. LeBanc was decent. Peterson, I would say, was probably the weakest link on this line, but there's always going to be a weakest link on a line of 3 players. That's inevitable. Even if one line was absolutely absurdly amazing, there has to be one worst player, and so that's kind of the case here tonight for Peterson. This line was pretty good. Peterson was just slightly less pretty good. When it comes to the third line, like I said, Gregor joining Sturm and Zetterlund here. I thought Sturm in particular had a very nice game. Obviously, he does manage to get a goal here tonight. Definitely has been potentially the best pickup by Mike Grier in this offseason. Was a signing that I was somewhat hesitant about when it was made, but has certainly paid dividends. And while there were a couple of other suspect signings from Grier, this is definitely one that has paid off, which has been nice to see. When it comes to Zetterlund, He has been probably a bit on the disappointing side from the Timo Meier trade. He's not necessarily the big piece of it. That would obviously be Mukhamadullin, as well as the first-round pick and the second, potentially first-round pick as well. But Zetterlund is the piece that could have paid the most dividends immediately and hasn't really done so. So slightly disappointing on that end. And Gregor, I thought, decent game for him. But while this was a very impactful game for the bottom six for the San Jose Sharks as a whole, it wasn't more so the third line as much as it was the fourth line that I thought stood out in a very positive light. Now, I was not necessarily critical of the fourth line against the Vancouver Canucks. I just mentioned that they did pretty much nothing in that particular game, but here they were significantly better. A few very good chances for them. Obviously, Martin Kaut managed to score a goal. That was off of a nice play from Lorentz and a very nice shot from him as well. And just generally, it felt as though this fourth line was pretty effective on many of the shifts that they had, so that was definitely nice to see. On the defensive side of things, we had Vlasic and Carlson managing to put up his 90th point of the season with another 2 assists here tonight. I mentioned in that review of the Vancouver Canucks game that it seems less likely that it'll actually be managing to hit the 100-point mark, and if the Sharks had continued to put up games like they did against Vancouver, that was seemingly likely, but if they can put up games like they did here tonight against the Calgary Flames, 100 points is potentially in reach, especially with the amount of offensive opportunities that he continues to set up. Like I mentioned earlier, Agazino with multiple grade A opportunities here tonight. Carlson probably could have had maybe another assist on one of those potentially. When it comes to the other defensive pairings, there were a couple of substitutions. Both Knyzhov and Derek Pouliot step out of the lineup here tonight in favor of McDonald and Benning. It's no surprise Benning would be inserted back in, but McDonald being put back in over a player like Knyzhov, I was somewhat surprised about. It's kind of the similar situation as the Gregor-Peterson swap. I'm not necessarily happy about it, but I also can't really argue against it. While I do really like Knyzhov as a player, it's not as though he's been that amazing over the past couple of games, and while I also don't like McDonald as a player, I wouldn't say he's necessarily been worse than Knyzhov when he has been in the lineup, so to get a bit of a change-up makes sense, especially after the awful performance against the Vancouver Canucks, so I don't necessarily disagree, and while McDonald wasn't amazing here tonight, he was decent enough. And then finally we have Kaapo Kähkönen. It's, a game, he lets in 4 goals. It's not super impressive. His stats as of late have been awful, and you can certainly try and say, oh, well, the Sharks are not playing particularly good in front of him, and that's definitely true. No one is going to argue that the Sharks have been playing well in front of Kaapo Kähkönen, but I don't think over the last month we can argue that Kaapo Kähkönen has been playing well himself, so that's just that. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they will take on the Winnipeg Jets. So the Sharks continuing to play off against these Canadian teams, though this time the Sharks will be back at home. Class dismissed.